in a war that has so starkly illustrated gender-based differences. Let us not lose sight of this. I have seen firsthand the impact of women's leadership can have. Yet women are largely absent from any current negotiation efforts. We ask the Security Council, all member states, and our development and humanitarian partners to ensure the meaningful participation of women and girls, including from marginalized groups, in all decision-making processes, peace, diplomacy, and humanitarian. Without this, we will not have peace, development, nor human security. To conclude, we strongly echo the Secretary General's repeated calls for peace, an immediate cessation of hostilities, and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territories. Tatiana, the young girl from the shelter in Moldova, must be supported and enabled to pursue her medical degree and to be a part of the future of her country. The war must stop, and it must stop now. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Behus, for the briefing, and good morning. From me, I now give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Fontaine.
Mr. President, Excellencies and colleagues, first I would like to express my appreciation to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and to Ambassador Ferit Hoxha for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Ambassador Woodward and the United Kingdom for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. I actually just returned from a mission to Ukraine, and I must say in my 31 years as a humanitarian, I've rarely seen so much damage caused in so little time. Friday's attack on Kramatorsk train station was particularly horrifying. The station has been a critical route for thousands of families fleeing Donetsk Oblast, an area that has seen some of the war's worst violence and destruction. When the station was attacked, it was filled with families desperate to escape the mounting violence. I note the tragic irony that our teams were actually offloading life-saving humanitarian supplies only a kilometer away when so many lives were taken away by this needless act of violence. The attack on Kramatorsk station is unconscionable, and yet it is just one of many instances in this war where we have seen a blatant disregard for civilian lives and international humanitarian law. Inside Ukraine, children and families and communities are under attack. Of the 3.2 million children estimated to have remained in their homes, nearly half may be at risk of not having enough food. Attacks on water system infrastructure and power outages have left an estimated 1.4 million people without access to water in Ukraine. Another 4.6 million people have only limited access. The situation is even worse in cities like Mariupol and Kherson, where children and their families have now gone weeks without running water and sanitation services, a regular supply of food and medical care. They are sheltering in their homes and underground, waiting for the bombs and violence to stop. As of yesterday, the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office has verified 142 children killed and 229 children injured. We know these numbers are likely much higher, and many of them were caused by crossfire or the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I actually met one of those children in an intensive care unit in the hospital ward of Zaporizhia. Vlad, who is a 4-year-old, was shot twice in the stomach as he was escaping with his family from a contested area. Although still unconscious, Vlad is expected to live, unlike so many others. All the systems that help children survive are also under attack. Hostilities have damaged or destroyed hundreds of residential houses. Attacks on hospital, healthcare facilities, and medical equipment, and the killing and injuring of healthcare professionals are making it even harder for people to access emergency care, basic health care, and medicine. Hundreds of schools and educational facilities have been attacked or used for military purposes. Others are serving as shelters for civilians. Nationwide school closures are impacting the learning and the future of 5.7 million school-aged children and 1.5 million students in higher education. In the Donbass region, a whole generation of children have already seen their lives and education upended during the past 8 years of conflict. We applaud the effort of the authorities to ensure continuity of education. However, this can only be a temporary solution. Lessons from the pandemic show that the importance of children learning in a school with their peers and teachers. Excellencies, I met families in Zaporizhia who told me that they wanted to stay in their homes, but were forced to flee when the shelling and violence became too much. Thousands of others now are trying to leave before the fighting closes in around them. They face further dangers along the way, missiles, crossfire, and explosive remnants. In just 6 weeks, nearly two-thirds of all Ukrainian children have been displaced. They have been forced to leave behind everything, their homes, their school, and often their family members. I have heard stories of the desperate steps parents are taking to get their children to safety, and children being saddened that they are unable to get back to school. A social worker told me a story about parents who were forced to send their children with a truck driver just to get them away from the line of fire. Such unaccompanied children, of course, are at much higher risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. Women face a particular risk. We are extremely concerned by increasing reports of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. Fortunately, there has been an outpouring of support from neighboring countries to welcome refugees. The solidarity expressed for Ukrainian refugees has been a very welcome development, one that surely should be replicated globally for all seeking protection and asylum, no matter where they come from. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are doing everything we can. Inside Ukraine, we continue to face extremely difficult operating conditions. We have seen some progress in recent weeks with our teams and supplies able to reach Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kramatorsk, among others. But this is not enough. Ongoing hostilities prevent us from reaching those most in need in many areas of the country. We saw that last week in Kramatorsk, when our teams were actually forced to stop offloading supplies and had to evacuate to safety following the nearby explosions. We are also helping local authorities to identify and register unaccompanied and separated children. We are providing families with much-needed humanitarian cash assistance and increasing awareness to minimize the risk of explosive ordnance. In Zaporizhia, I visited a reception center set up by local authorities, run mostly by women professionals, for displaced people to access health and psychosocial services, have a warm meal, and rest temporarily. These services are critical, but they are not the solution. Many of those who were able to flee early have been able to find sanctuary in other countries. It is not clear how those who are being displaced now will actually fare. They have been exposed to violence for longer and may have less resources at their disposal. Resources are already overstretched, and local residents live in a state of uncertainty as the sound of air raids and warnings from local officials ring regularly, reminding them that the front lines may soon reach them too. Excellencies, I'm particularly concerned about the widespread presence of explosive remnants of war which expose children to the risk of death and horrendous injury. Eastern Ukraine was already one of the world's most mine-contaminated stretches of land, even prior to the recent escalation. This reality is rapidly extending to other parts of the country. We are also carefully monitoring the health, rights, and dignity of women and girls as the risk of exploitation and abuse grows. And we continue to reiterate the need to ensure that children who have become separated from their families and who live in institutional care are protected, and that every effort be made to obtain caregiver consent and authorities' approval before these children are evacuated or relocated. In closing, I want to express how proud I am of our UN teams both inside Ukraine and in neighboring countries. The work they are doing is indispensable. I want to also salute the remarkable resilience of Ukrainian doctors, nurses, teachers, and social workers, especially women who have been at the forefront of the response. I was personally deeply impressed by the care they are providing children and families. I visited an underground maternity ward in Lviv that is staffed 24/7 by a team of tireless women assisting birth amidst air raid alerts. Local women's organizations are mobilizing grassroots networks to care for the most vulnerable, even on the darkest of circumstances. Their courage and commitment are a light in the dark. But most of all, I want to entreat all those with the power to end this war to actually use that power. The lives and future of millions of children hang in the balance. Excellencies, the math is simple. Every day the war continues, children will continue to suffer. As humanitarians, you can count on us to continue doing our work, but there's only so much we can do. It is time to end this war. Ukraine's children cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Mr. Fontaine, thank you very much. I now give the floor to Ms. Katerina Charapaka, who joins us on the video link. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. Today I have an honor and responsibility to speak and testify as a part of civil society organizations who stand for protection of independence and freedom of Ukraine for invasion by Russia. Organizations who consolidate their efforts at the national, regional, and community level with state and individuals, men and women, adults and children, who provide assistance, who help to save lives of civilians, often most vulnerable ones, who collect evidences and testimonies of survivors of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, to document them and to help to bring justice. I speak as a women's rights activist, as a specialist, as a mother, and since February 24, as a displaced person. With a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the whole population of the country is under the life threat. Women and children, as it always happened in the wartime, are the most vulnerable ones. In my presentation, I would like to focus on 4 aspects related to the impact of Russia's aggression on women and children. Women and children are the biggest part of internally displaced people and refugees who left the country trying to save their lives. Often, they become invulnerable to the risk of gender-based violence, exploitation, and trafficking. Very often, during evacuation, with clearly indicated signs of being civilian, unarmed, carrying children, they are brutally killed by Russian troops. Hit in railway station in Kramatorsk, where civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, were waiting for evacuation train. The city where our colleagues, women's rights activists, put so many efforts to promote 1325 resolution and its spirit. Hit in maternity and child hospitals, kindergartens. Bombing theater building in Mariupol, where women, children were sheltering, and with a clear signs, children that were visible from the sky. The city that always connected us with sisters and colleagues from Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. We received calls from women in Mariupol informing about forced deportation of civilians, including unaccompanied children, by Russian troops to Donetsk and further to Russia. So-called evacuation. Women were deported under the threat of rape and killing. Women in local administration, self-government bodies, they are also exposed to threat of kidnapping, torture, and killing. The head of Matizhin village, Kievska Oblast, Olga Sukhenka, was found dead together with her husband and son after being taken by Russian troops who occupied the village, severely tortured and killed, for staying with her community and performing her duty, organizing support, medicine, food to people. The deputy of Zaporozhska Oblast administration, Leila Ibragimova, was kidnapped from her home. Director of the kindergarten in Kievska Oblast, Larisa Osipenko, killed by occupants because of her profession. You should not rise Nazis, they said. This tragic list of crime committed by thousands of ordinary Russian soldiers claiming that they didn't know where they are can be continued. Women are the important actors of peace and security sector in Ukraine, and their contribution during the war is really incredible. Together with activists, volunteers, journalists, they also become the target of the occupants. Ukrainian volunteer Yulia Payevska, Taira, many years for saving lives of people in the occupied by Russian territories on the east of Ukraine, captured by Russian troops while organizing assistance for civilians in Mariupol. A video with captured Taira was shown where she was forced to call to find the solution of the situation. At this moment, there is no information about her condition and what the situation is now with her. Women prisoners of war, exposed to torture, including sexual violence, undressed in front of the male groups, harassed, shamed. Journalists, female journalists kidnapped in Zaporozhska Oblast, 2 journalists, and another one killed near the Kiev while performing their professional duties. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and rape during the wartime. A number of facts and cases already revealed and reported, but unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg that we'll see. Many survivors remain in the situation of life threat. They are staying on the occupied territory. They are cut off from help, connection, from everything. We receive such calls to the national hotlines operated by La Strada Ukraine. For today, we have 9 cases of rape by Russian soldiers in the temporary occupied towns and villages. About 12 women and girls, children. Reports from Kievska, Khersonska, and Chernigivska Oblast, reported by the survivors themselves and by the witnesses. Raped by a group of occupants multiple times with life threat to survivors, their children, their family members, in front of the family members and other people. Real cases, real people, real facts. We see extreme traumatization, fear for life, not readiness to talk about what had happened. Those who manage to escape somehow to safer place are too traumatized to report. They need support, therapy, recovery first. We know that many of these cases will hardly or even never be disclosed, unfortunately, as many of those suffered are killed already by Russian invaders. We know and see, and we want you to hear our voices, that violence and rape is used now as a weapon of war by Russian invaders in Ukraine. At the same time, the war also shows the important role that women play in standing for Ukraine, in the processes of restoring the peace, strengthening and developing on the country and democracy process. We do not want you to look at us only as victims of Russian military aggression. Women in peace and security sector, volunteers, activists, journalists, human rights defenders are an integral part of the progress and development in Ukraine. We have knowledge, we have skills, we have expertise, we have strength, but we need to be saved and protected now. We call to all members of the Security Council, international institutions, the governments, to stop the war and demonstrate your solidarity in the concrete and practical actions, to find and to use the tools to stop Russian aggression and to ensure that your decisions are not blocked and not ignored. We call to ensure security of children, women, and men of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Katerina Charapaka for her briefing and thank her for joining us today. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And with that, I begin with Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the United States. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. We're honored by your presence here with us today and thankful to the United Kingdom for leading this debate. Thank you to our briefers from UN Women and UNICEF for your remarks and for the work your teams are doing on the ground. I too visited Romania and Moldova and saw your teams on the ground working with vulnerable people. And I'd like to give an especially strong thank you to Ms. Charapaka for being with us today and for sharing the voices of women and children in Ukraine. She's the first civil society briefer we've had brief us in an official council meeting. Thank you very much. When men like President Putin start wars, women and children get displaced. Women and children get hurt. Women and children get raped and abused, and women and children die. Since the start of Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, Russia has bombed orphanages and maternity hospitals. We've seen mass graves with dead children stacked on top of each other. On Friday, a train station being used for civilian evacuations, mostly women and children, was struck by a Russian missile. Washington Post reporters saw at least 20 dead, including children. Limbs and luggage were scattered everywhere. A maimed dog shivered next to one of the dead. According to the reporters, a large piece of missile on the scene had chilling words written on the side. In Russian, it said, "For the children." That is what Russia's war looks like. What is happening to women and children in Ukraine is horrific, beyond comprehension. Mr. President, When I was in Moldova and Romania, I saw with my own eyes some of the human toll of Russia's brutal war. I met with a few of the 11.6 million people who are now displaced from their homes, representatives of the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The mass displacement includes over half of all of Ukraine's children. Half of Ukraine's children have left behind their homes, their schools, and often at least one of their parents. Meanwhile, 90% of refugees from Ukraine are women and children. And as our briefers made clear today, being a woman or a child adds an additional risk. Women in Ukraine are at increased risk for gender-based violence, including rape, sexual assault, and sexual exploitation. We know that anyone at risk before war is at a heightened risk of being targeted for physical and sexual violence during a war, and that includes women and children, religious and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI+ individuals, and people living with disabilities. The deputy mayor of Ivankiv told reporters that some girls are cutting their hair short in hopes of avoiding rape by Russian troops. Family separations leave girls in particular at increased risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking. And we've heard sobering reports of traffickers targeting women as they seek protection abroad. All of this is why the United States initiative, Safe from the Start, calls on all humanitarian actors to prioritize resources and programs to address gender-based violence from the onset. Given everything we know about gender-based violence in conflict and the accounts we're hearing, we cannot wait for a lengthy assessment. We should not hold up resources with the excuse of incomplete data. This is an active crisis that grows worse by the day. We need to start interventions immediately to prevent and respond to gender-based violence now. For our part, the United States funded humanitarian efforts in and around Ukraine, lift up networks for survivors of gender-based violence in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, and we're supporting programs for child protection and advocacy too. We will continue to support our partners in these efforts. For example, we're highly supportive of UNICEF's mobile child protection teams, and we're working in conflict zones like Ukraine to deliver life-saving supplies and provide emergency social work services. These horrific acts also remind us that we must support efforts to prevent them from happening in the first place. This means ensuring that women's voices and rights are always respected and elevated. And it means ensuring that abuses against them and against children are held to account. There must be pathways to healing and access to justice for survivors. Finally, I want to remind us all that women are far from passive victims in this war. As we just heard from UN Women, women are playing critical leadership roles in Ukraine to address this impact of the war. Some women are valiantly defending their homes, their communities, their country, including many women who've been serving in the Ukrainian military since 2014. Others are protecting their families and their children, bringing them to safety. And still others are the ones supplying food and shelter, water and medicine to those in need. Women are the ones who will get Ukraine through this humanitarian catastrophe, and women must be consistently and meaningfully involved as active participants and leaders in securing long-term sustainable peace. When I met with women in Moldova and Romania, they all had different stories, but they all had the same dream: to return to a peaceful Ukraine, to return to a Ukraine where they have a say in their own and their children's future. Let us ensure women are a robust part of that peace process, and let us hope that day they dreamed of comes soon. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, Lord Ahmad, for chairing this meeting, a testimony of its importance and timeliness. Dear colleagues, the Russian aggression has not stopped. It continues to cause undue pain and suffering to 44 million people who did not ask for it. The relentless brutality and the destructive force of actions of the Russian army against civilians and vital civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is catastrophic. Unspeakable crimes have been committed, and each day the various pieces of the horror puzzle are falling in place. Grisly images of bodies charred or run over by tanks, mass graves, torture chambers, interceptions confirming that Ukrainian prisoners of war had been shot dead after being interrogated by Russian soldiers, playgrounds cribbled with bullet holes, kids' shoes scattered among the rubble of a school in ruins. Everyone is suffering in Ukraine, but the situation is particularly devastating for women and for children. This is why we called for this meeting, and what we heard from the briefers, whom I thank, is appalling. We're very pleased to listen to Ms. Cherepaka, and all accounts coincide. We just don't know yet all the horrible details. Hundreds of thousands of women have been forced to flee their homes. Others are fighting bravely to protect their country or work under bombardment and indiscriminate shelling as doctors, nurses, and other professionals providing essential service to their communities. We express our gratitude to all countries for their big heart in helping Ukrainians fleeing the war. Women and girls face heightened risks of gender-based violence, human trafficking, exploitation, and conflict-related sexual violence due to displacement. Their needs must be a priority in the humanitarian response. But the situation of children is even worse. As we heard from Mr. Fontaine, since the start of the war, 2/3 of the total child population of Ukraine have been forced out of their homes. Those still inside the country remain trapped in what has become a national nightmare. And if all this were not enough, some 120,000 Ukrainian children have reportedly been forcibly deported to Russia. Save the Children reports that since the start of the war, an average of 22 schools have come under attack every single day in Ukraine. Last October, this Council adopted Resolution 2601, which urges all parties to cease attacks and threats of attacks against schools. It was us. Destroying on purpose the educational infrastructure and making it dysfunctional for the years to come is simply criminal. Schools should be safe places, free from any kind of violence. And learning during conflict and crisis must be maintained, as it helps maintain a sense of normalcy and foster resilience. We know that mass displacement and refugee flows always create conditions that could lead to human trafficking and an acute child protection crisis. We commend UNICEF for the good work in providing recreational activities and psychological support in Ukraine. Blue Dot centers are offering crucial services of counsel and protection. Mr. President, some 150 children will never see the end of war in Ukraine. They have been killed. Hundreds more, injured, will bear the marks of this war forever on their body. Children's lives are always shaped by the behavior of adults who themselves struggle in times of war. They have the duty to provide care and protection and ensure their upbringing. But how can a frightened mother holding her child avoid passing on her worst nightmare and fear that all of a sudden the kid may end up alone? How to explain war to children who in a matter of hours had to leave behind their family environment, friends, pets and toys, and who traumatized are unable to sleep or eat? In their normal life, children draw parents, houses and trees. Russian war has made Ukrainian kids draw bombs, tanks and weapons. Mr. President, civilian massacres carried out by Russian forces have rightfully stirred world outcry. Russia should have learned that a war can't be won through massacres. During the wars in the Balkans in the late 90s, the crimes against innocent civilians in Vukovar, Croatia, Srebrenica in Bosnia, and Racak in Kosovo did not help any of the perpetrators win the war. And this war will be no exception. We hear public indignation on one recurring question: why can't the UN do more to stop Russia? This question is right, and the anger is justified, because Russia, with its veto, has taken this council hostage, preventing it to deliver security in Ukraine. But thankfully, there is more of the UN that Russia cannot veto. We have met here 15 times in 10 weeks to expose Russia's despicable deeds and show its isolation. Also, in a matter of few weeks, Russia has, in 3 crucial consecutive votes, been put against the wall in the UNGA, which, in a remarkable and historic move, suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. While deploring the Council's inability for reasons clear to all, we should be proud of the UN for standing firm against aggression, for looking Russia right in the eye and say, you are wrong and you will pay. Under international law, a military commander is responsible for war crimes committed by his troops. Lieutenant Colonel Azatbek Omurbekov, the Russian commander involved in the occupation of Bucha, will have to answer for the atrocities of rape, pillage, and murder of hundreds of Ukrainian civilians for such repugnant disregard of human life. If Kremlin thinks that they will benefit from the Tefal effect, they are wrong. Their crimes stick to their face. 5,600 investigations have been opened so far by Ukraine Prosecutor General. Accountability must be ensured. Dear colleagues, before anyone had the time to grasp its breath from the horrors discovered in Bucha and elsewhere around Kiev, a missile hit a train station where several thousand people were waiting to leave. A missile with a vicious signature for all children was sent to kill indiscriminately, including 5 children. And again, we were told, it's not Russia. Haven't we enough of this ridiculous pattern when Russia commits a crime and attributes it to someone else? Who was behind an attempt to overthrow the legitimate government in Montenegro? Who was behind the MH17 plane tragedy hit by a missile? Who carried out indiscriminate bombardments in Aleppo? Who poisoned the Skripals? Who almost killed Navalny? Who is putting the world upside down by a war of choice? All these crimes lead to Russia. We know now that the Russian army doesn't attack civilians except for the residential areas, the schools, the hospitals, the theaters, the kindergartens, and train stations. And we know also that Ukrainian men, women, girls, and children do not qualify as civilians for Russia. They are just a bargaining tool to achieve one man's cynical goal in assimilation and isolation, to force the hand of Ukraine into unacceptable concessions. Life expectancy in Ukraine is now at Kremlin's will. It may decide whether you stay in one of those shattered cities and you starve. It may decide to kill you with its missiles that hit everything indiscriminately. He may also offer the forced hospitality of a Russian camp. Mr. President, as we speak of children, let me end with this note. Reportedly, President Putin is a father. This is one of those words that do not need a definition. And if I were in the unlikely situation to talk to President Putin, the only question I would ask him would be, would you have accepted that your daughters be in the same situation as the 11-year-old Yuri, Ukrainian, who, forced to leave his home, terrified, tells reporters that, and I quote, "Every time there was a shelling, my heart stopped," end of quote. So stop making hearts stop. Stop shelling and bombardments. Order your soldiers still alive to go home, your home, Russia. As the Pink Floyd blasted last week, hey, hey, rise up. It is time for the Russians to come to their senses and stop and stand against this savagery. Thank you.
I thank Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France, Mr. Ambassador.
Monsieur le Président, je tiens à remercier Madame Baos, Monsieur Fontaine et Madame Chéré-Paca pour leurs exposés. Ceci confirme la profonde préoccupation que nous avons exprimée depuis le début de l'agression russe. Nous sommes encore sous le choc de l'attaque abominable contre la gare de Kramatorsk vendredi. Celle-ci pourrait constituer un crime contre l'humanité, comme l'a souligné le ministre Le Drian. Les attaques indiscriminées doivent cesser. La France est gravement préoccupée par la multiplication des allégations de violences sexuelles. Les résolutions de ce Conseil sur les violences sexuelles en temps de conflit s'imposent à tous. Nous soutenons ainsi l'action des Nations Unies sur place pour établir les faits et les responsabilités. Ces violences ne sauraient rester impunies. La France appelle par ailleurs au renforcement du soutien apporté aux survivantes de violences sexuelles. Nous condamnons à ce titre les destructions d'infrastructures de santé et leurs conséquences sur l'accès à la santé sexuelle et reproductive. Les attaques contre les hôpitaux peuvent également constituer des crimes de guerre. Nous l'avons entendu, la guerre bouleverse aussi la vie des enfants ukrainiens. Les meurtres et mutilations d'enfants resteront des taches indélébiles sur leurs auteurs, tout comme les attaques contre les écoles. Nous appelons le secrétaire général des Nations Unies à se saisir des outils mis en place par ce Conseil pour protéger les enfants contre les graves violations les visant. Par ailleurs, les populations civiles sont particulièrement exposées dans le cadre des déplacements contraints. Nous soutenons l'action des Nations Unies pour prévenir les risques de traite. Monsieur le Président, face à cette agression aux conséquences insupportables sur les femmes et enfants d'Ukraine, la France reste entièrement mobilisée. Nous appelons à une cessation immédiate des hostilités, à un retrait total des troupes russes de l'intégralité du territoire ukrainien, comme l'a exigé la Cour internationale de justice, et à un plein accès humanitaire. Près de 500 tonnes de matériel humanitaire ont été envoyées par la France. Elle a aussi annoncé une contribution exceptionnelle de 100 millions d'euros pour la réponse humanitaire. Nous avons également déployé en France un dispositif d'accueil et d'accompagnement pour les femmes et enfants ukrainiens. Près de 10 000 enfants ukrainiens arrivés en France ont déjà pu être scolarisés. La lutte contre l'impunité doit être menée avec vigueur. Nous avons déjà annoncé notre appui au travail d'enquête et de documentation mené par la Cour pénale internationale dans le respect de son indépendance. Une contribution exceptionnelle de 500 000 euros a également été accordée au fonds dédié. La France continuera à soutenir tout effort d'enquête indépendante sur les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme en Ukraine. Enfin, la France soutient la mise en œuvre de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité dans toutes ses dimensions. Nous saluons le courage des femmes ukrainiennes en première ligne de la réponse humanitaire, politique et militaire en défense de leur pays. Nous rappelons qu'il ne pourra y avoir de solution durable au conflit sans la pleine participation des femmes. Monsieur le Président, nous continuerons à soutenir les femmes et enfants ukrainiens aussi longtemps que nécessaire et ne céderons pas dans nos efforts pour le retour à la paix. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now invite the representative of Ghana, Your Excellency.
I thank you, Mr. President, and welcome your leadership over this meeting of the Council on the important and timely discussion on the impact of the war on women and children in Ukraine. I would like to thank Ms. Sima Bahaus, Executive Director of UN Women, and Mr. Emmanuel Fontaine, the Emergency Operations Director of UNICEF, for their respective briefings on the situation. We are also grateful to Ms. Katerina Sharapaka, President of the civil society group La Strada Ukraine, for the views shared with the Council. Mr. President, the continued situation of instability and insecurity in Ukraine continues to be a matter of deep concern for Ghana. My delegation is particularly alarmed by the situation of women and children as well as of the aged, arising from the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. Ghana strongly deplores the reported acts of widespread and what is emerging to be gross violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. We condemn the attack of 8 April 2022 on the train station in Kramatorsk, which resulted in significant civilian casualties, and commiserate with the bereaved families and the people of Ukraine. We continue to be pained by the horrifying images of war in Ukraine and by the daily images of fright and despair in the eyes of a people who just a few weeks ago lived normal and stable lives. In situations of war, women and children suffer a disproportionate humanitarian impact, and the war in Ukraine has been no different. Ghana is particularly concerned by the situation of the children of Ukraine who are being scarred by the horrifying images of war. Children should never go through such experiences and must accordingly be protected by all parties in accordance with applicable international law. We note the UN's report that around 4.3 million refugees have fled Ukraine into the neighboring countries, with women and children making up 90% of the refugee population. We regret the 142 children who are reported as having been killed, alongside the 229 others injured. Without the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, these numbers would increase. We therefore call upon the warring parties, especially the aggressor state, to redouble all efforts for peace in the interest of the women and children of Ukraine, including the women in need of assistance who constitute more than 54% of the people in need from the ongoing crisis. Mr. President, the rising food insecurity, lack of access to essential social services in cities like Mariupol, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv have invariably increased the burden of local women responsible for the care of children, the disabled, and elderly family members. The war has severely impacted social cohesion, community security, and the resilience of local communities, especially for women and girls. The destruction caused by the war, particularly with the use of explosive weapons with wide impact area in civilian populated areas and targeted at medical facilities, has created profound health crisis, with women, girls, and children bearing the greatest brunt of such deprivations. Women and young girls face an increased risk of disruption to life-saving sexual and reproductive health services and access to specialized medication and treatment. Ghana unequivocally condemns the reports of trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and exploitation. Such atrocities impact negatively on the physical and psychological health of the victims, as well as on their general well-being, both in the short term, but also over the longer-term period. We therefore encourage humanitarian agencies to ensure that identified victims are provided with the needed medical and psychosocial care to overcome the trauma of abuse. We underscore the need for accountability for all alleged violations of international humanitarian and criminal laws, and reiterate our call for an immediate, independent, and impartial investigations to establish the facts of these offenses and build the evidence to hold the perpetrators of such atrocities to account. Mr. President, the gender-related challenges of the war necessarily required a prioritization of the needs of the women and children and the implementation of gender-responsive humanitarian assistance. In this regard, women leaders at all levels of society should be included in coordination mechanisms and decision-making processes. In the spirit of Resolution 1325, we urge the parties to consider including women in their negotiating teams as a way of ensuring their meaningful participation in their diplomatic and political processes. It is important that women are not only counted as victims of the war, but as key participators in finding a lasting and durable solution. In closing, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to heed the repeated calls of the international community to withdraw all of its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and pursue the path of dialogue and diplomacy. The cessation of all hostilities and maintenance of effective and safe humanitarian corridors remain fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian conditions, especially the unbearable impact of the conflict on Ukrainian women, girls, and children. I thank you very much, Mr. President, for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now invite a contribution from the representative of Mexico. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Excelencia, sea usted bienvenido a este consejo. Agradecemos las presentaciones de la directora ejecutiva de ONU Mujeres, Sima Bajus, de Manuel Fontaine, director de emergencias de UNICEF, y de la señora Caterina Cherepaca, cuya visión desde la sociedad civil nos recuerda la vulnerabilidad, pero también nos recuerda la fortaleza de las mujeres ucranianas. Toda la información disponible nos confronta con un panorama francamente desolador. La realidad es que cada día que pasa, y en tanto el conflicto continúa, las tragedias aumentan y las necesidades humanitarias se multiplican. México condena el reciente ataque a la estación de trenes de Kramatorsk, en el que perdieron la vida, lamentablemente, decenas de civiles que esperaban ser evacuados, incluidas mujeres y niños. Los ataques contra la población civil y la infraestructura civil violan el derecho internacional humanitario y pueden constituir crímenes de guerra. Esta estación de trenes se encuentra a solo 1 kilómetro de donde UNICEF operaba la entrega de ayuda humanitaria, como nos han informado. Es la misma estación por la que llegan los insumos que se requieren para otorgar dicha asistencia. Las mujeres y las niñas y los niños de Ucrania están siendo los más afectados. Representan el 90% de la población refugiada y se encuentran en alto riesgo de tráfico y explotación. Las estimaciones de UNICEF indican que son casi ya 2 millones de niños los que han cruzado fronteras y muchos de ellos lo han hecho solos, no van acompañados. Y aquellos que se han quedado con sus familias o están en proceso de ser evacuados corren el riesgo de ser víctimas del uso de armas con defectos indiscriminados. Tampoco debemos olvidar los severos impactos de corto y largo plazo que todo ello tendrá sobre la salud mental. Los traumas de la guerra que sufren tanto menores de edad como adultos pueden llegar a ser graves e irreversibles. Señaladamente, familiares de víctimas mortales, sobrevivientes de ataques, desplazados y refugiados. Los daños causados a la infraestructura habitacional, educativa y sanitaria oscurecen aún más el panorama. Las mujeres ucranianas han sido las primeras en responder a las necesidades urgentes de sus comunidades. Los testimonios de doctoras, enfermeras, psicólogas y voluntarias que atienden a la población más vulnerable, como pueden ser las personas adultas mayores o con discapacidad, son ejemplos de solidaridad y al mismo tiempo evidencia de las dimensiones humanas más sensibles del conflicto y quienes las están atendiendo, las mujeres. Necesitamos que el sistema de las Naciones Unidas y en particular ONU Mujeres y la Oficina de la Representante Especial Pramila Patten continúen recolectando evidencia, datos desagregados y análisis con enfoque de género sobre las múltiples dimensiones del conflicto, incluida señaladamente la violencia sexual. Se requiere toda la información verificada que se pueda. En nuestra calidad de copresidentes del grupo que lleva la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad, habremos de convocar a reuniones de seguimiento para mantener el tema con la prioridad que se requiere. En adición al impacto diferenciado y al costo que han asumido millones de mujeres, es necesario aumentar su participación en el proceso político. Urge incluirlas en todos los posibles canales de diálogo y negociación. Ocurre que, al igual que en el resto del mundo, las mujeres ucranianas son agentes de cambio fundamentales y deben participar de manera plena, igualitaria y significativa en los procesos de toma de decisiones y en las negociaciones de paz. Señor presidente, finalizo reiterando nuestro llamado a un cese inmediato de las hostilidades, al acceso irrestricto y sin condiciones de la ayuda humanitaria y a la búsqueda de una solución diplomática del conflicto sin exclusiones. Muchas gracias.
I thank Mexico for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this opportunity to welcome Your Excellency to this meeting. I would also like to thank Ms. Seema Bajos, Executive Director of UN Women, Mr. Manuel Fontaine of UNICEF, and Ms. Katerina Sharapaka of La Strada, Ukraine, for their briefings and insights into impact of the situation on women and children, particularly with respect to education. Women and children invariably suffer the most in any armed conflicts or military confrontation. From reports coming out of Ukraine, women and children have been disproportionately impacted and form the bulk of the refugees and internally displaced persons. More than 4.4 million people have moved to neighboring countries, and another 7.1 million are displaced inside Ukraine. We commend the Ukraine's neighboring countries who have welcomed refugees from Ukraine, and especially for treating women and children with compassion and dignity. As a country which has welcomed refugees over centuries, India knows the importance and value of treating them equally and with dignity and catering to their needs and requirements. In this context, we need to keep the gender perspective in mind and act with sensitivity. We call for a victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts. The impact of situation on education of children has also been severe. It has further aggravated the pandemic-related challenges that children were already facing. There are reports that more than 900 education facilities and schools have been either damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. Let us also not forget that the situation has also affected foreign students, including Indian students. India facilitated safe return of 22,500 Indian nationals, most of them students studying in various universities in Ukraine. We are exploring options to minimize the impact on our students' education. We appreciate the relaxations made by the Ukrainian government for this academic year in respect of medical students. Even as we deal with the influx of refugees, we continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine and reiterate a call for immediate end to hostilities. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. Since the inception of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of human lives, especially that of women and children. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the conflict. Allow me to reiterate the importance of the UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. We continue to emphasize to member states that the global order is anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank India for their statement. I now invite the representative of Ireland, Your Excellency.
Thank you, President, and my thanks also to our briefers, and in particular to our civil society briefer, Katerina Cherepaka. The sobering words we've heard this morning leave us in no doubt as to the human misery and suffering inflicted upon the people of Ukraine by the Russian Federation's senseless and illegal war. We've all seen the images. We've all seen the grim realities of this war. A pregnant woman carried on a stretcher from the ruins of a maternity hospital. A young child on a train looking longingly at the father who cannot board. Bodies lying abandoned in improvised mass graves. People lying dead following the indiscriminate attack against a train station in Kramatorsk by the Russian Federation on Friday. This attack on innocent lives, mostly women and children, is yet another attempt to close escape routes for those fleeing this unjustified war and to cause human suffering. Ireland strongly condemns this and all attacks on civilians. They are just glimpses of the suffering caused by the Russian Federation's war. They tell only part of the harrowing experiences of women and children in Ukraine. Theirs is a story of widespread displacement and trauma, facing extremely serious risks of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. Reports of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers, including rape, proliferate, with bone-chilling allegations that children are among those violated. Conflict-related sexual violence can constitute a war crime, and those responsible must be held to account. Accountability must not only be for those who physically perpetrate such acts, but also for those military commanders who fail to take all necessary and reasonable steps to stop them, or fail to ensure that they are investigated and prosecuted. Ukraine's displacement crisis deepens every day. Of those who have fled the country, 90% are women and children. The large population of older women, women with disabilities, and those of marginalised groups, including the Roma and LGBTQI+ communities, are particularly vulnerable in this conflict. Millions of women face impossible decisions around evacuation. As their lives and their families are threatened, do women journalists stay to report? Do women healthcare workers and those in caregiving roles stay or go? Do women in the Ukrainian army who choose to bring their children to safety return to defend their country? So many are making the desperate yet heroic choice to remain. President, a child protection crisis is emerging as the number of unaccompanied and separated children rises. We have a responsibility to respond. The terror of war and the trauma of family separation will have lifelong effects on millions of Ukrainian children. We need to mitigate these impacts, including through psychosocial services and mental health support, healthcare, and education in emergency settings. This month marks a year since every member of the Council co-sponsored and agreed Resolution 2573 on the protection of civilian objects. That includes the Russian Federation. That day, we sent a united message strongly condemning attacks against civilians or civilian objects. 12 months later, where is that unity on display in Ukraine? Thousands of civilian objects, including hundreds of schools and kindergartens, have been destroyed, largely due to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Attacks on schools are a grave violation. To rob children of their education has profound impacts not only on their individual development, but on society as a whole. The reverberations of this war reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. They will also reach beyond this generation. This war will mark Ukraine for many years to come. We all have a responsibility to support them long after this war has ended. At this table, we have repeatedly called for it to end, for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces and engage in true dialogue and diplomacy towards peace. In any peace talks, we must have direct, substantive inclusion of diverse women so they can influence the course and outcome of negotiations. Without them, we can have no hope for sustainable peace. Let us not forget that Ukraine has been a society where women were fully and equally participating in public life. Targeting women through violence or forcing them to flee to save their children's lives is a double abomination in a society that was realizing the fruits of women's participation. This war will undo years of progress towards gender equality. And as my Mexican colleague referenced, we are focused on these issues also as co-chairs of the IAG on Women, Peace and Security. President, I conclude by stressing that gender equality is not an aspiration reserved for peaceful countries, somehow too difficult or inconvenient for countries in conflict. The evidence shows that women's participation in peace processes leads to better and longer-lasting agreements. The guns are still firing with a dire impact on women. The urgency to ensure their active participation in ending this conflict has never been greater. Yet it is because of their deep-rooted participation that we are hopeful for the future that women of Ukraine can help to shape. Thank you.
I thank Ireland for their statement. I now invite the representative of Norway, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, President. And thank you to UN Women, UNICEF, and Katarina Sharapaka, from whom, again, this Council has heard alarming assessments of the consequences of Russia's war. We are deeply troubled by the atrocities committed against civilians in places that have been held by Russian forces, including credible reports of extrajudicial killings of civilians. We condemn the missile attack on the railway station in Kramatorsk. These atrocities shock the conscience of humanity. The protection of civilians and the respect of human rights are not a matter of choice. These are legal obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Yet, the reality is that women and girls of Ukraine now face a drastically heightened risk of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. Just last week, USGD Carlo briefed the Council on disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces, including brutal acts committed in front of children. The sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls have also been severely diminished due to displacement and the targeting destruction of health facilities. For many, including refugees, it means the near total loss of access to essential, sometimes life-saving assistance. Our humanitarian response, therefore, must also be gender and age sensitive to avoid and address protection gaps. President, in the midst of intense warfare and the calls for Russia to end the violence and negotiate in good faith, there is a tendency to forget that women are also at the front line in every way. Ukrainian women are among the combatants fighting to defend their country. They ensure delivery of basic and life-saving services, and they most definitely suffer the full consequences of war. It is therefore imperative that their rights are respected and that their full, equal, and meaningful participation is ensured in any political processes, talks, and negotiation regarding the future of Ukraine and its people. Children's lives and well-being are constantly threatened by the ravages of war. They are traumatized by violence, displacement, and the destruction of the places that they live, learn, and play. Their future is at stake. Norway is alarmed by the reports that more than 60% of Ukraine's children are now displaced as a result of Russia's illegal invasion. We call for the immediate cessation of attacks on and threats of attack against school, students and teachers, in line with Resolution 2601 and the Safe Schools Declaration. And we recall the obligation of parties to conflict to facilitate the continuation of education. President, Norway supports the assessment by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that the ongoing violence by Russian forces raises serious and disturbing questions about possible war crimes, or even crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of international humanitarian law and serious violation of international human rights law. This underlines the importance of the ongoing investigation of the situation in Ukraine by the International Criminal Court, as well as the Human Rights Council, and their work to investigate all violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. There is no doubt that the physical and psychological wounds that this war will be felt for generations. So once again, we call on Russia to cease its attack on the Ukrainian civilian population and to stop this senseless war.
Thank Norway for their contribution. Now I invite Brazil, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to commend the work of Ms. Bauhaus and Mr. Fontaine in Ukraine and thank them for the briefings. I also thank Ms. Chedepaka for her statement. As the conflict in Ukraine persists and we enter into the 7th week of hostilities, Brazil remains deeply concerned about the daily reports of gross violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The images of violence against civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure are deeply disturbing. The politics behind this or any other conflict should not affect the obligations of all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law. I believe there are no divergences between member states that the protection of children in armed conflicts should be a priority at all times, even when parties cannot find common ground for the peaceful settlement of their disputes. We continue to call on all parties and relevant actors to work towards well-planned and agreed-upon arrangements on the ground that provide respite for the civilian population, allow for civilians to leave conflict zones in safety, and for humanitarian assistance to reach those in need, including and very specially children. Children should never be uprooted. Their physical integrity and well-being should be a fundamental priority to all member states, especially in times of armed conflict. Schools and medical facilities should never be used for military purposes, nor should they become targets of direct attacks or indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks. It is of the utmost importance to implement Resolution 2601 on the protection of education, co-sponsored by 98 member states, including Brazil. The Safe Schools Declaration also provides important guidelines on this matter. Moreover, it is key that women and children be placed at the heart of peace negotiations to ensure their protection from hostilities, as well as the cessation of attacks against civilian infrastructure. In particular, Resolution 2573 provides fundamental guidance for the protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population and should be duly observed. Mr. President, reports of sexual violence are appalling and must be independently investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. Available evidence on the psychological impact of sexual violence in conflict, a crime that affects women and girls, but also men and boys, suggests that it is often lifelong and even intergenerational. Brazil reiterates its calls on all parties to cooperate with the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with the necessary clarifications, including by identifying, where possible, those responsible for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. In this regard, we welcome the participation of UN Women in the Commission of Inquiry, with experts skilled and experienced to investigate sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation in the context of war. We also thank UN Women for its efforts to obtain gender-sensitive data, which is essential to adequately address the situation of women and girls in Ukraine. UNICEF findings show that the ongoing conflict has caused one of the fastest large-scale displacements of children since World War II, a tragedy that could have long-lasting consequences for generations to come. We worry that as more women and children are forced into the condition of refugees or internally displaced persons, they become more vulnerable to crimes, including sexual violence and exploitation. All efforts should be made to provide refugee children and adolescents with essential services, including education and mental health services. In conclusion, Brazil draws attention to the importance of the work that has been carried out on the ground to reach those most affected by the conflict in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, especially women and children. We reiterate our call on all parties to comply with their obligation to ensure free and unimpeded humanitarian access that must comply with the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Brazil for their statement. I now invite the representative of China.
主席先生，我认真听取了各位通报人的通报。妇女儿童最易遭受暴力活动的冲击和伤害，在武装冲突中应当受到优先保护。我们呼吁乌克兰局势的当事方严格遵守国际人道法，切实保护妇女儿童人身安全，尊重并保障学校、医院等设施的民用属性和安全，在疏散、救援、医疗救助等方面对妇女儿童给予特殊照顾。中方对克拉马托尔斯克火车站的袭击造成包括妇女儿童在内数十名平民伤亡感到痛惜。事件的相关情况和具体原因必须查清，任何指控都应以事实为依据。冲突发生以来，有大量妇女、儿童从乌克兰进入周边国家避难。中方赞赏有关邻国和其他国家向他们打开边境，并为其提供安全庇护和人道救援。所有难民无论肤色、种族、宗教信仰，根据国际法都应获得必要和平等的保护。乌克兰和周边国家人道需求依然巨大，联合国人道协调办公室、妇女署、儿基会等国际机构应继续动员协调国际支持，向所有有需要的人提供人道救助，特别要考虑妇女、儿童的特殊需求，提供有针对性的医疗救治、心理疏导和社会服务，保障儿童受教育的权利。我们对有关寻求避难的妇女、儿童被拐卖和受侵害的报道深表关切，呼吁妇女署、儿基会、难民署、人权高专办等国际机构加强监测，支持有关国家采取措施，坚决防止他们遭受二次伤害。主席先生，尽快让战火平歇，才能从根本上解决乌克兰人道危机， 使妇女儿童远离暴力伤害。对话谈判是通向和平大门的唯一出路。我们支持当事方继续开展谈判，努力克服困难和分歧，为达成停火积累条件，为妇女儿童能够早日看到和平曙光做出积极努力。国际社会其他各方都要多做有利于对话谈判的事，为谈判取得进展营造必要环境和条件。必须指出，一味实施制裁、输送武器不会带来和平。不断升级的全方位、无底线制裁，引发粮食、能源危机和生活必需品价格飞涨，让全世界人民为此付出沉重代价，更让阿富汗、也门、非洲自角、萨赫勒地区数千万的妇女儿童成为严重受害者。中方再次呼吁各方保持理性克制，采取负责任态度，为妥善解决乌克兰危机、早日恢复和平做出建设性努力。谢谢主席先生。
I thank China for their statement, and I now invite the representative of the United Arab Emirates, Your Excellency.
Mr. President, Lord Ahmed, I'd like to begin by thanking you and welcoming you for chairing this meeting. I'd also like to thank Ms. Bahous, Mr. Fontaine, and Ms. Cherapacha for their briefings and insights shared. Mr. President, when this Council adopted the Women, Peace and Security Agenda more than 21 years ago, it recognized the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and girls. Women are not only exposed to grave violations of international humanitarian law, but are particularly vulnerable to gender-specific risks as well. However, the WPS agenda also recognized that women and girls are active agents of peace who can drive efforts and provide solutions. Their participation in conflict prevention, peace building, reconciliation, and reconstruction must be guaranteed, not only because of the impact the conflict has on them, but also because it has proved to result in more sustainable and longer-lasting peace. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of the 4.3 million people who have fled to neighboring countries are women and children. There have been deeply disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence and those who have fallen prey to criminal organized gangs running human and sex trafficking rings. According to the WHO, there have been 89 healthcare facilities across the country impacted by attacks, undermining the right of women and girls to access healthcare. This contributes to a lack of critical maternity care for pregnant women, both within Ukraine and for those fleeing abroad, as the UNFPA has warned. Finally, the conflict is disrupting children's access to education. Every child has a right to education, and this can further block their opportunities and capabilities to contribute to Ukraine's future. This risks a generational effect. Accordingly, the UAE would like to highlight 3 areas to support women and children impacted by the war in Ukraine. First, we see the ongoing negotiations between the parties as a positive development, and we call on them to guarantee women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all peace efforts. It is imperative that women's leadership and participation not only take place at the end of the conflict, but also in the design and implementation processes for its peaceful resolution. Women have been leading local reconciliation and dialogue efforts for many years now in eastern Ukraine. These efforts should not be forgotten. Rather, they should be recognized, built upon, and mobilized to drive efforts towards peace. Second, sex disaggregated data collection on the impact of the conflict remains a valuable tool, including in strengthening accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. This can ensure that restorative justice can be achieved. Third, a gender-responsive approach must be implemented in all humanitarian efforts during and after the conflict. This should include the voices of women who can inform the provision and delivery of humanitarian assistance, services, and programming efforts with their needs at the center. We also call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular, the protection of civilians, and to allow timely and unimpeded humanitarian access. Mr. President, I want to also highlight the disproportionate consequences this war has on women and children around the world. From food insecurity to high commodity prices, women and girls worldwide are seeing their daily lives and their futures upended. More than ever, we need concerted efforts to prevent that from happening. The stakes are too high. In conclusion, we reiterate our strong call for an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine to allow for constructive dialogue between the parties and to end the suffering caused by this conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now invite the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour votre leadership dans la conduite de nos travaux. Je remercie Madame Sima Baous et Monsieur Manuel Fontaine pour leurs exposés. Je remercie également Madame Katrina Sherpaka. Monsieur le Président, l'escalade dévastatrice de la violence en Ukraine porte atteinte à la sécurité des femmes et des enfants, qui représentent aujourd'hui la plus grande proportion des populations civiles qui fuient en masse les zones de combat ou se terrent dans des abris de fortune, souvent dans des conditions inhumaines. Le nombre de personnes déplacées augmente au rythme de l'intensification des combats. Il atteint à présent la dizaine de millions, parmi lesquels d'innombrables enfants qui ont traversé les frontières de l'Ukraine sans être accompagnés. Des témoignages persistants font état de violence et de viol à l'égard des femmes et des filles. Le témoignage de M. Fontaine de l'UNICEF sur des réseaux de traite des personnes humaines est alarmant. Les violences sexuelles contre les femmes et la traite des êtres humains sont inacceptables. Il est crucial que des enquêtes indépendantes et impartiales soient diligentées pour établir les faits et les responsabilités. Monsieur le Président, alors que la guerre s'enlise, les attaques contre les infrastructures civiles, dont les établissements de santé et les écoles, affectent considérablement l'accès des populations à l'eau potable et aux soins de santé primaires et spécialisés. La baisse de la couverture vaccinale de routine fait craindre la résurgence de certaines maladies infantiles. De même, les mouvements massifs des populations, les ruptures d'approvisionnement, la détérioration des conditions d'hygiène ainsi que la promiscuité constituent des conditions propices au développement des épidémies. Monsieur le Président, cette guerre doit cesser. Des actions urgentes doivent être prises pour répondre aux besoins importants des populations civiles et en particulier les femmes et les enfants. Nous notons avec intérêt le renforcement par l'UNICEF de ses équipes mobiles et de l'augmentation de ses fournitures en produits de première nécessité et en services essentiels en vue d'atténuer les souffrances et accroître la protection des enfants dans les zones de conflit. Il est urgent que l'aide apportée aux femmes et aux enfants soit renforcée, y compris par des soins de santé mentale et émotionnelle et un soutien psychosocial. Des dispositifs de protection spécifiques aux femmes et aux enfants doivent également être mis en place pour prévenir les risques de traite de personnes. Je voudrais réitérer toute l'appréciation de mon pays au travail des humanitaires qui sont aux avant-postes dans les lieux de combat, parfois au péril de leur vie, pour secourir et protéger les civils. Nous appelons les parties à leur faciliter l'accès à toutes les localités dans lesquelles l'aide humanitaire est devenue vitale. Mon pays appelle à un cessez-le-feu et à l'ouverture de couloirs humanitaires dans l'ensemble des localités en vue de la fourniture de l'aide humanitaire dans des conditions optimales de sécurité. Aussi longtemps que les travailleurs humanitaires ne pourront accéder à ceux qui ont besoin de cette aide d'urgence, des personnes continueront de mourir, aussi bien des balles que de la faim et des maladies. Je voudrais à nouveau réitérer l'appréciation de mon pays en direction des pays voisins de l'Ukraine, qui continuent de se mobiliser pour l'accueil d'urgence des réfugiés. Nous les encourageons à accorder le même accueil à toutes les personnes en détresse sans distinction. Nous demandons le respect de leur dignité et appelons à un traitement équitable de toutes les personnes en détresse. Je voudrais également réitérer l'appel aux parties à s'engager de bonne foi dans le dialogue en vue de mettre un terme aux hostilités. Nous demandons aux belligérants de se conformer à leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, cette guerre doit cesser. Elle est insoutenable, elle est déshumanisante, elle doit cesser immédiatement. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I thank Gabon for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Your Excellency.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Благодарим сегодняшних докладчиков за предоставленную информацию. Коллеги, мы не сомневались, что сегодня со стороны наших западных коллег вновь прозвучит множество измышлений в отношении того, что сейчас происходит на Украине в свете проводимой нами специальной военной операции. Алгоритм ваших действий нам давно понятен. Извратить и очернить цели СВО, замолчать неудобные для вас факты и продвинуть фейки и пропагандистские наработки Украины и работающие на киевских режим профессиональных западных пиарщиков. Все ваши усилия логично вписываются в логику, развязанной в отношении России информационной войны, которая по своей интенсивности не уступает боевым действиям на земле. Новую планку дезинформации задают сегодня наши албанские коллеги. Постред Албании сегодня перечислил почти весь список приписываемых нам преступлений, не потрудившись упомянуть, что ни по одному из них так и не было представлено хоть сколько-нибудь убедительных доказательств. Понятно, что презумпцию невиновности вы уже давно растоптали. За последнее время совместная западная и украинская фабрика по производству фейков вышла на новый уровень и приступила к фабрикации и постановкам в лучших традициях печально известных британско-сирийских белых касок. У всех до сих пор на слуху беспрецедентная, как по своей жестокости, так и по топорности исполнения, провокация в городе Буча Киевской области. Ее пока еще продвигают в качестве якобы совершенного российской армией преступления. Несмотря на неопровержимые свидетельства о постановочном характере произошедшего, которые только множатся. Не буду останавливаться на деталях. Об основных из них мы подробно информировали Совет Безопасности в прошлый вторник. После того, как британское председательство в нарушении базовых правил процедуры Совета сделало все, чтобы не допустить проведения отдельного заседания по этой провокации. Скажу только, что при тщательном анализе действий укронацистов сложно избавиться от дежавю. В 1944 году идейные учителя киевских радикалов, действуя в лучших традициях главного гитлеровского пропагандиста Геббельса, устроили провокацию с якобы зверски убитыми красноармейцами в деревне Немерсдорф, в Восточной Пруссии, мирными жителями. Этому предшествовал циркуляр, разосланный в крупнейшие немецкие газеты, в котором подробно описывалось, как лучше преподнести якобы злодеяния советских солдат. В наше время газеты читают все меньше, и подобные руководства появляются в соцсетях, причем их даже особо не скрывают. Набирают артистов для массовок, ориентируют, на каких моментах следует остановиться. Одним словом, Геббельс был бы доволен размахом своих украинских последователей, однако их подвело исполнение. Инсценировки в Немерсдорфе, нацеленные на создание легенды о якобы совершенных красноармейцами массовых убийствах и изнасилованиях, впоследствии были убедительно опровергнуты различными экспертами. А имя поселка стало нарицательным для обозначения грубой пропагандистской инсценировки. Точно как та, которую реализовали в Буче. Однако бучинскую провокацию на уходящей неделе затмила другая, которую укронацисты реализовали в пока еще находящихся под им контролем Краматорске. Это классическая операция под чужим флагом. Остановлюсь над ней подробнее, тем более, что многие ее сегодня упоминали. 8 апреля из окрестностей населенного пункта Доброполье в 45 километрах к юго-западу от Краматорска украинские вооруженные силы нанесли удар тактической ракетой «У» по железнодорожному вокзалу города Краматорска. Погибло более 50 человек, из них 5 дети. В больнице Краматорска были доставлены 98 человек, среди которых 16 детей, 46 женщин и 36 мужчин. Почему мы с такой уверенностью говорим об ответственности именно украинских, а не российских военных, как это сразу же показали западные СМИ, и как об этом сегодня говорил ряд наших коллег? По нескольким причинам. Назову 3 из них. Во-первых, на вооружении российской армии не имеются тактические ракетные комплексы «У». Они устарели, были давно заменены на «Искандеры» и активно используются только армией Украины. Во-вторых, сделанные по горячим следам еще до прибытия украинских пропагандистов снимки очевидцев позволили безошибочно определить не только тип ракеты, но и направление, откуда она прилетела. И этот район пока удерживается украинскими войсками. Наконец, в-третьих, по тем же снимкам легко идентифицируется номер «У». Она относится к серии Ш-915. Ракетами из этой же серии неоднократно обстреливались мирные города Донбасса. Есть их обломки с соответствующими номерами. Таким же боеприпасом 14 марта 19-я отдельная ракетная бригада ВСУ осуществила ракетный удар по центру Донецка. На месте погиб 21 житель Донецка, 36 ранены. Ужасные кадры этого обстрела западные СМИ до сих пор выдают за обстрел Киева. В общем, провокация в Краматорске киевскому режиму также не удалась. Но украинские пропагандисты явно пытаются учесть свои ошибки и сработать чище. Они очень стараются. Только за последние дни мы передали в ООН информацию о следующих готовящихся провокациях. Постановочное обнаружение массовых захоронений в селе Раковка под Киевом. В город Кременная заблаговременно прибыли репортеры зарубежных СМИ. Их цель – зафиксировать подготовленную ВСУ провокацию с обстрелом якобы российской армии автомобилей скорой помощи, которые переводят пациентов. В селе Белогоровка заминированы резервуары с хлором на территории водоканала, который планируется взорвать при подходе к городу формирования народной милиции ЛНР. В городе Ирпень Киевской области осуществляется провокация по схеме Бучи-Немерсдорфа. Сотрудники СБУ планируют привезти из морга при городской больнице на улице Полевой в подвал одного из зданий на восточной окраине города тела погибших от обстрелов артиллерии мирных жителей. Затем в Пущеводецком лесном массиве СБУ будет организована постановочная акция со стрельбой и уничтожением якобы российской разведывательной группы, прибывшей в Ирпень для убийства свидетелей якобы военных преступлений России. При этом в качестве бесспорных доказательств в лесу будут представлены тела ранее убитых националистами под пытками пленных российских военнослужащих. Ждем распространения видеоматериалов от этой постановочной акции западными СМИ. Вот только сегодня Министерство обороны Российской Федерации озвучило, что в город Середина-Буда Сумской области, ранее находившийся под контролем российских войск, приглашены представители западных и украинских СМИ для проведения постановочных видеосюжетов. В населенном пункте Нижняя Сыроватка под Сумами в один из подвалов стаскиваются тела. Постановкой сюжета о якобы зверствах российской армии занимаются британские режиссеры. Российские войска, напоминаю, покинули этот город 3 недели назад. Все эти сообщения поступают нам от жителей, которые находятся в этих местах и которые неравнодушны к целям нашей военной операции. Не могу также не сказать о сообщениях от одесситов, о том, что в городе в большом количестве замечены бойцы ВСУ, переодетые в российскую военную форму. Похоже, что в этом городе также готовится масштабная и кровавая провокация, точнее операция под чужим флагом. Коллеги, не говорите потом, что мы вас об этом не предупреждали. Уже осуществленные и планирующиеся провокации в сочетании с оставшей уже нарицательной практикой использования националистами мирного населения в качестве живого щита поражают бесчеловечным отношением к судьбам народа Украины и свидетельствуют о полном пренебрежении укронацистами нормами морали и международного гуманитарного права. Россия, как мы неоднократно говорили, с мирным украинским населением не воюет. Господин председатель, поскольку наше сегодняшнее заседание проходит в том числе по теме «Женщины, мир и безопасность», не могу обойти и этот сюжет. Применительно к Украине он, конечно же, также крайне идеологизирован и пронизан провокациями. Видим четкое стремление представить российских солдат садистами и насильниками. Как и в свое время садистами и насильниками стали пытаться представить советских солдат-победителей во Второй мировой войне. Видим, что не меняются ни цели, ни русофобский заряд, доставшихся Украине по наследству пропагандистских методичек. Действительность, однако, свидетельствует совсем о другом. Несмотря на все исхищрения, даже до западного читателя временами доходит информация о зверских пытках мирного населения садистами из украинских националистических батальонов, жертвами которых становятся в том числе и женщины. Так, увиденное в здании начальной школы номер 18 города Мариуполя, которая долгое время удерживалась нацистским батальоном Азов, шокировало даже видавших виды военных. На полу в углу подвала тело женщины. Руки отсечены, лицо изуродовано. На животе выжжена свастика. Примечательно, что эти ужасающие и уже публиковавшиеся фотосвидетельства на Украине и на Западе некоторые и сейчас пытаются выдать за преступления российских военных. Господин председатель, украинское общество последовательно обрабатывалось националистами в течение как минимум 8 лет. Поэтому и украинские женщины, к сожалению, порой предстают в довольно странном, я бы даже сказал, диковатом образе. Лучше всего это иллюстрирует патриотический видеоролик, активно распространяемый по соцсетям в последние дни. На нем одна из западноукраинских актрис под патриотические речевки и проклятия в адрес России серпом перерезает горло замученному российскому солдату. Единственное, с чем этот ролик вызывает ассоциации, так это с террористами из ИГИЛ, которые также распространяли видео, на которых они перерезают горло своим жертвам. Печально, что Украина докатилась до подобной безудержной жестокости, до слепого, не отстающего от игиловского радикализма и экстремизма. Видя это, лишь убеждаешься в необходимости и безальтернативности осуществляемой Россией специальной военной операции. Операции, необходимые ради будущего Украины, а также безопасности не только России, но и всех других соседей Украины. Вряд ли, например, мирные поляки могут чувствовать себя спокойно в условиях, когда устроители Волынской резни, унесшие жизни десятков тысяч их соотечественников в 1943 году, сегодня почитаются на Украине в качестве национальных героев. Я говорю именно о мирных поляках, а не об ослепленных русофобией и польских властях, политика которых давно уже потеряла здравый смысл. Господин председатель, завершить хотелось бы на более оптимистичной ноте. Есть, разумеется, и другая Украина, получающая благодаря нашей военной операции новый шанс на мирную жизнь и подлинное добрососедство. У этой Украины уже появляются свои символы, в том числе и женщины. Так, мало кого оставил равнодушным широко разошедшийся по соцсетям видеоролик, снятый вошедшими в одно из селений украинскими солдатами. Вышедшая им навстречу старенькая бабушка ошибочно принимает их за россиян и берет с собой красное советское знамя Победы. Говорит им добрые слова о том, как долго она ждала освобождения. Солдаты, надо отдать им должное, бабушку, несмотря на это, не обижают. Дают ей пакет с продуктами. Но взамен забирают знамя и начинают его топтать. И тогда бабушка, поняв свою ошибку, демонстративно возвращает им продукты и требует вернуть знамя, за которое воевали ее родители. Дальше ролик обрывается. Очень хочется верить, что с бабушкой ничего не случилось. Ведь ее подвиг и смелость уже вдохновили многих. Хочется также верить, что уже совсем скоро она дождется освобождения и сможет без опаски вынести из дома красное знамя и в священный для всех нас День Победы почтить память своих родителей и тех, кто освобождал Украину от нацистов, не боясь при этом, что кто-то будет топтаться на этом знамени. Благодарю за внимание.
I note the contribution from the Russian representative. I now invite the representative of Kenya. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome back to New York. I thank USG and UN Women Executive Director Sima Bahous, UNICEF's Director of Emergencies Manuel Fontaine, and Ms. Katerina Cherepaka for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine and the permanent representatives of the affected countries in the region. Mr. President, we would not be here having this discussion but for the armed breach of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We must again observe and condemn the continuing disregard for international law and the United Nations Charter and the anarchic, dangerous world that has resulted. Kenya further condemns the recent bombing of the train station in Kramatorsk, where more than 50 people were killed as they attempted to flee the war. This war is causing massive civilian suffering. We do not have an accurate count of the lives lost to violence, but they must be in the thousands. We have no figure for the instances of rape and other forms of sexual violence against girls and women, but it is certain that the number is high and rising. We know that the overwhelming majority of refugees who have fled Ukraine are girls and women, and we also know that each one of them, in their own special way, has had their life shattered by this war. We know that such forced human movement and family separations increase the potentials for sexual abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. We must commend all the individuals and institutions and governments that are helping in every possible way. We especially thank those UN organizations such as UN Women, OCHA, UNICEF, UNHCR, UNFPA, and other agencies for their reports that highlight the key areas of concern for Ukrainian women and girls. More than that, we thank them for the actions they're taking to help women and girls fleeing and trying to survive this war. We also applaud today the brave women of Ukraine who are fighting for peace and for their country. We recognize with admiration the women who are leading in government and civil society in pushing us all to a peaceful resolution of the war. Mr. President, in the last year, our delegation has been in the Security Council. We have spoken regularly about women, peace, and security. Most often, it has been to applaud the role of women as peace builders and to urge their participation in decision-making at all levels. Today, I urge that we let the full weight of the suffering of women in Ukraine to settle in our minds. Perhaps then we will have the will as the Security Council and the international community to attain a ceasefire, and the boldness of vision to undertake a diplomatic dialogue that can provide lasting security in Europe and globally. The victims that I'm speaking about are fleeing bombs and bullets overwhelmingly fired by young men on the orders of their older male superiors. These men are themselves dying in large numbers, and in doing so, their mothers and sisters and daughters are mourning them. On either side of the violence of this war are women, the ones who are suffering the effects of the war in Ukraine, and the mothers of the soldiers in the Russian Federation who must wait in agony, wondering if their sons will return home or have been involved in attacks on civilians. No one knows a greater agony than the grieving mother of a fallen soldier or the grieving mother of a soldier who has returned home from a campaign that featured atrocity. Mothers are on either side of the war. They are suffering the dangers and atrocities being carried out on their children and by their children. It is therefore exceedingly inappropriate that in the public reporting of the negotiations for a ceasefire, we see few women and mothers at the table. We urge all relevant actors in the ongoing negotiations and those that follow to ensure the inclusion of women as participants and decision makers. The same should be the case for all the institutions and operations that are responding to this war. We call for humanitarian corridors to be established and protected. We urge that the humanitarian actors make certain that their operations have the ability to aid women and girls, particularly those who are survivors of rape and other forms of gender-based violence. If the war continues much longer, it will harm the food and energy security of many millions around the world. It will destroy livelihoods, increase poverty, and cause economic crisis. For a global community barely starting its recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine is a damaging blow. The result will be early deaths, political instability, and the escalation of other conflicts. The humanitarian and developmental response to that suffering must leave no country or region behind. In this regard, Kenya continues to urge the Secretary General to rally the United Nations, the major economies, and international financial institutions to design instruments that offer the most vulnerable countries, particularly in the Global South, needed support. Mr. President, I finish by once again reaffirming Kenya's lasting support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the Ambassador for Kenya's statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. May I begin, first of all, in joining others in thanking the insightful and expert and deeply thoughtful contributions of our briefers. My thanks go to Seema Bahaus from UN Women, to Mr. Manuel Fontaine from UNICEF, and of course, Ms. Katerina Charapaka gave us a direct insight of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And in doing so, it reminds me that the Geneva Conventions contain numerous provisions that afford special protections to women and girls as civilians in conflict zones. Yet, what we see today with our own eyes, and as today's detailed briefings testify, is harrowing evidence of how women and girls are suffering. Mr. Putin's invading forces are absolutely oblivious to even the most basic tenet of the Geneva Conventions, the distinction, the absolutely essential distinction between civilians and combatants. Today, sadly, we've once again heard Russia trying to deflect from the facts, the reality on the ground, muddy the waters by what can only be described as quite extraordinary statements and even lies. Yet what is true, what is fact, is that Russian attacks on civilians and residential areas have been truly barbaric. Yet what we've seen shine through this as a real beacon is the Ukrainian people themselves. Ukrainian women have demonstrated incredible fortitude and demonstrated the real resilience of the Ukrainian people. Indeed, that was reflected in the engagement our own Prime Minister had in Ukraine recently. And I myself, as we heard from the representatives of UNICEF, from UN Women, and indeed the representative of the United States, I've also had the opportunity, and I'm pleased we're joined by Poland. When I visited Poland, I saw the strength and support of the Polish people, the incredible welcome being given to fleeing refugees, but also the resilience of Ukrainian women, predominantly women, as we've heard from many statements today, who are crossing the border. They're being forced to cross the border because they want to protect their children who accompany them. We've also met and seen female members of parliament who have resorted, because they can't sit as parliamentary members, to take up firearms, to defend themselves, to defend their people. We've seen incredible courage from civic leaders refusing to leave their communities, to the countless and absolutely incredible untold stories of heroism across Ukraine, as women have stood up to Russian forces. many armed with little more than patriotism, their own sense of courage and resilience, and a fair sense of injustice. Emerging reports paint a deeply disturbing picture, including alleged rapes and sexual violence within Ukraine's borders. The violence and exploitation does not end there. Beyond the borders, displaced Ukrainian women and girls, as we've heard again today, face heightened risks of trafficking, a point made by UNICEF, and also sexual exploitation by criminal gangs. The mounting evidence of war crimes in Ukraine compels us, surely as the international community, to come together to stand and do more and stand with Ukraine, and stand with those who have faced such unspeakable violence. The vote recently to suspend the Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council was proof of our collective will to do just that. We must now work ceaselessly to investigate these crimes and to hold Mr. Putin, Russia, and the forces of Russia to account. And that is why the United Kingdom has worked closely with partners to refer this illegal invasion to the International Criminal Court, to establish a commission of inquiry through the Human Rights Council, and to establish an OSCE mission of experts. Ukraine's women, like many women around the world as they continue to do today, help build that open, democratic, free Ukraine, a society that for some reason Mr. Putin fears. And Ukrainian women's participation at all levels, as we heard today from colleagues from Ireland and Kenya, amongst others, will be central if we are to build a sustainable and lasting peace. And any peace settlement must also reflect the disproportionate impact of this conflict, this war, on the girls and women of Ukraine. In conclusion, today's UN Security Council discussion and meeting is a rallying call to us all, the international community, to recognize the impact of this illegal war, the impact of this illegal war on the very basis and foundations of international law, on the very basis and attack on the very foundations on which this institution, the United Nations, is based, the actual charter of the United Nations itself. And it is an illegal war on the women and children of Ukraine. And ultimately, we must come together and act together to hold Russia to account for these crimes. I now resume my function as President of the Council. Before we go to the countries who are not part of this Council, I've had a request from the representative of Albania, who's asked to take the floor to make a further statement. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I listened carefully to the Russian colleague, and I'd just like to highlight three short aspects. First, we do not come here to make propaganda. We all know where the propaganda comes from these days, and it is not certainly from here. Second, what we say here is fact-checked and corroborated. Facts and truth are not for discussion, even when we do not like them. Third, if we are here to talk about these issues, painful ones, it is because of Russia's actions, including this aggression. Continue to claim that there is no war of aggression in Ukraine is equal to continue to claim that the world is flat. We know there are people who believe it, but that doesn't make it true. And finally, the only true threshold here is the appalling degree of unspeakable crimes we are discovering in Ukraine, unseen in Europe since decades. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now move to other contributions, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Executive Director Sima Bahouz, Mr. Manuel Fontaine from UNICEF, Ms. Katerina Cherepacha from Ukraine, La Strada. I also recognize a representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Although a more appropriate seat for Russia government's representatives seems to be at a trial for war crimes committed in Ukraine, since today's lies from Putin's representative predictably contain everything but the kitchen sink. As one says these days here in New York, we know Russians lie because their lips are moving. There is nothing to write home about, as the Russian comrade hasn't even shown himself out of the chamber after that embarrassment of an intervention. Lights are on, but nobody is home at the Russian mission. Mr. President, George Orwell believed that totalitarianism and the corruption of language were closely connected. Now I have to put my earphones to listen carefully to the Russian interpretation of the next couple of sentences. It is an important development that the Security Council is now addressing the issue of the Russian war against Ukraine under a new agenda item, maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. I would like to thank those Security Council members who supported its introduction. I find the interpretation I have heard quite satisfactory. What I find not satisfactory at all is how the Russian diplomat, in his statement upon the approval of the agenda item, used the Russian language to impose a different concept of reality. The agenda item, as approved, reads as follows. Once again, maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. It is neither on Ukraine nor Ukraine, as the Russian diplomat purposefully manipulated, nor any other linguistic fantasies of the Russian mission. In fact, it's not the first time the Russian mission hopes to avail of the fact that the majority of you do not speak Russian, like it was in the last session of the Security Council when Ambassador Nebenza tried and failed to quote a Russian language interview, rather. The language used for the title is exceptional for conflict-specific issues, which are mostly refer to situations in specific countries or questions concerning them. It is an acknowledgement that peace and security of Ukraine have been violated from abroad, and the Security Council will remain seized of the matter until they are restored. Along with the letter dated 28 February 2014 from the permanent representative of Ukraine to the UN addressed to the President of the Security Council concerning the threats to the territorial integrity of Ukraine due to the Russian attempted annexation of Ukraine, the new agenda item will serve as a framework for the Security Council's actions in response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We may defeat militarily Russia in Ukraine sooner than we may deoccupy Crimea. That is why I hope, and I'm sure, that the Russian proposal to remove the letter of 2014, that is basically about Crimea, will not be supported by the necessary number of the Security Council members. Mr. President, on the 24th March, an overwhelming majority of the UN member states adopted the General Assembly resolution, Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. They particularly demanded in that resolution that civilians, including humanitarian personnel, journalists, and persons in vulnerable situations, including women and children, be fully protected. Russia voted against, thus openly showing it considers civilians, including women and children, to be a possible target. Since the beginning of its invasion, this Russian approach has proved to be true almost on a daily basis. Just last week, in the presence of the President of Ukraine, the Security Council addressed the massacre committed by the Russian troops in the city of Bucha and other towns and villages of Kyiv region during the period of occupation in March. Over the past week, a number of foreign officials, UN representatives, and foreign journalists have attended the crime scenes. Shock and outrage were the main responses of those who saw those killed and tortured, who listened to those raped and robbed. The investigation had just started, but the futility of Russia's shameless attempt to decline responsibility is clear to everyone. Unfortunately, Russia persists in adding newer and newer items to the list of its war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. On April 8, Russian missiles hit the Kramatorsk railway station, where almost 4,000 civilians, mostly elderly, women and children, were waiting for evacuation trains from the war zone. More than 50 people, including 5 children, were killed. More than 100 were wounded, many of them severely. I will not develop the false theory of Russia that Russia does not possess .U, including because Russia deployed many .U's in the territory of Belarus. It speaks volumes that Russian attempts to conceal the traces following the strike were similar to those Russia had resorted to after shooting down the MH17 flight in 2014. Initial triumphant reports by Russian propaganda, this time about hitting a concentration of Ukrainian troops in the Kramatorsk railway station, were deleted immediately after the information on the real outcomes of the strike appeared. Instead, the regular fake narrative on Ukrainians killing themselves was again activated. It will neither persuade others nor help Russia to escape responsibility. The world's trust in Russia and its diplomats is as dead as a doornail. The investigation will establish all responsible and they will be brought to justice. Dear colleagues, the scope of atrocities that the Ukrainian women and children suffer now has not been seen in the region since the end of the Second World War. Like its Nazi predecessors, Russia has launched a policy of extermination of the entire people. The Russian soldiers have been allowed by their superiors to kill everyone who identifies herself or himself as Ukrainian, regardless of who they are. The very modest, preliminary, and incomplete figures recorded by the OHCHR include 245 women killed as of April 7. The sex of 831 adults killed is yet unknown. According to our governmental sources, at least 183 children have been killed and 342 wounded. This toll of casualties, outrageous by itself, does not include the victims in Mariupol. It is impossible so far to establish how many women and children have been killed and injured there. In an attempt to cover up the killings of thousands of civilians in this besieged Ukrainian city, and to prevent Bucha-like publicity, Russian troops are reported to be deploying mobile crematoriums to burn dead bodies of civilians. Again, the historical associations are easily traceable. The inhuman cruelty of the Russian invaders has turned the lives of millions of Ukrainian women and children into a horrific nightmare. Fleeing from Russian liberators, more than 4.3 million refugees have left Ukraine. 6.5 million people have become internally displaced persons. The overwhelming majority of them are women and children. This is the largest displacement in Europe since the 40th of the 20th century. The safety of women refugees remains a matter of concern. We should focus on how to protect them from sexual violence and trafficking in either labor or sex schemes of exploitation, as well as on how to ensure physical and psychological recovery for victims. I would like to inform you in this regard that a special web page, safewomen.com.ua, with information on how to protect Ukrainian women and children from human trafficking has been recently launched in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the briefer from Ukraine has provided you with examples of appalling cases of targeted repressions against female officials and female activists in the occupied territories. The execution of Ms. Olha Sukhenko, the head of the village of Matizhin, Kyiv region, along with her husband and son, is just one of these examples. The entire scope of the humanitarian consequences of the occupation of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions has yet to be established. At the same time, the existing data already serves as a reminder of the extreme vulnerability of women and children in a situation of war. The withdrawal of Russian troops has revealed evidence of unimaginable suffering, with killings, unspeakable torture, and sexual violence, including rape and mutilation. For instance, the prosecutor's office is now investigating the case happened in Brovary district, Kyiv region, when a Russian soldier killed a local resident and then repeatedly raped his wife in their private house. The suspect's identity has been established. The Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, in cooperation with pretrial investigation agencies and healthcare facilities, is now launching a special mechanism of documentation of cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women. Prosecutors and investigators are also closely cooperating with human rights defenders and NGOs that provide the women affected with medical and psychological support. I would like to reiterate the message delivered by my President to the Security Council a week ago. We are ready for cooperation with international institutions to ensure full and transparent investigation. It is also important that the UN bodies, including UN Women and UNICEF, address these issues and ensure full-fledged monitoring of the situation with women and children in the situation of the war of Russia against Ukraine. I would also like to draw the attention of the Security Council to the fact that the invaders have already taken more than 121,000 children out of Ukraine. Moreover, Russia is reported to have drafted a bill to simplify and accelerate the procedure for the adoption of abducted Ukrainian children, both orphans and those who have parents and other relatives. Most of these children were abducted from Mariupol to Donetsk and Russian city of Taganrog. These actions flagrantly violate Article 7 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Mr. President, Ukrainian women have always been an indispensable part of the solution of crisis and conflict. The unprovoked and unjustified war waged by Russia has highlighted this role in government, business, and civil society. Since 2014, Ukraine's women have been increasingly engaged in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, guided by UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and Ukraine's commitment to a gender equality policy. Ukraine was the first of the world's countries to adopt a national action plan for WPS 1325 under wartime conditions, and Ukraine has now adopted a second national action plan until 2025. Ukraine's female activists have been active in promoting initiatives aimed at supporting the Ukrainian army, strengthening public awareness and preparedness to war-related emergencies. The Ukrainian government and local communities have been working together. The Ministry of Social Policy and the Government Commissioner on Gender Equality Policy have established a network of advisors in all Ukrainian regions to ensure a gender-sensitive response to all situations, including emergencies such as these. Ukraine's women are proactive on all levels of community action: community local governance, local humanitarian responses. Many high government positions are held by women, and they are promoting full accountability for the war crimes being committed now. Ukraine's women have been actively contributing to Ukraine's security as members of the army and law enforcement, as peace builders, human rights and women's rights defenders. They seek meaningful inclusion in all the processes to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and bring peace back to Ukrainian soil. Mr. President, let me conclude with another letter that was made public in Ukraine several days ago. A 9-year-old boy is writing to his mother on the occasion of the Women's Day. I quote, "Mama, this letter is my gift to you on the Women's Day of the 8th of March. Thank you for the best 9 years of my life. Many thanks for my childhood. You are the best mama in the world. I will never forget you. I wish you good luck in the heavens. I wish you to get to paradise. I will try to behave well to get to paradise too. Kiss you, your Tola." This was a 9-year-old boy from the town of Hostomel, Kiev region, and his mother was killed by Russian soldiers when they tried to escape from the occupied town by car. The boy stayed in the vehicle until local residents were able to rescue him and take him to a shelter. Such letters should not have to be written. If they are, it means that something has gone terribly wrong, including here at the United Nations. It would mean its mechanism of maintaining international peace and security aren't working properly and should be fixed. But could they be fixed while Russia is allowed to use the rights of a permanent member? If we are not able to stop the Kremlin, more and more children will become orphans. More and more mothers will lose their children. Today in Ukraine, tomorrow somewhere else. The Kremlin must be stopped for the sake of future generations, to save them from the scourge of war in Ukraine and throughout the world, as the UN Charter envisages. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of Ukraine. I now invite the representative of Poland to take the floor. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I would like to thank the United Kingdom and especially Ambassador Barbara Woodward for organizing this important and timely briefing and for shedding light on the situation of women and girls in Ukraine in the aftermath of Russia's aggression. I would like to thank the excellent briefers for their insights and most importantly all their work in supporting Ukrainian women and girls. All conflicts and humanitarian crises disproportionately impact women and girls. Not only do they suffer from direct military consequences, but also they are victims of instability, human trafficking, and sexual violence. That's especially true right now in Ukraine, as we heard. Mr. Chair, the number of people who fled Ukraine since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression on the February 24th has risen to over 4.5 million. Nearly 2.6 million of those refugees have arrived in Poland. The overwhelming majority of those trying to leave Ukraine are women and children. According to UNHCR, as many as 90% of those fleeing the country are women and children. They also constitute majority of the internally displaced persons. Women and children displaced with no contacts or help are at a higher risk of trafficking and other forms of abuse. They are physically and psychologically weakened, unfamiliar with their new surroundings, and highly vulnerable to become victims to criminals. This is true both for refugees and internally displaced persons. Reports are emerging of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women and girls who are fleeing the country. It is crucial to address the unique needs of women and children crossing the borders. Polish authorities have put measures in place in all border crossing areas and reception centers to control what has direct access to refugees. These measures include identifying and registering the names of those accessing reception and accommodation centers, and the names and registration plates of those with whom refugees leave sites. There are also information materials for people from Ukraine crossing the Polish-Ukrainian border. Leaflets are available in Ukrainian, Polish, and English, both in paper and electronic format. Mr. President, once in a safe haven, the importance of refugees' access to the labor market becomes a priority. Employment is not only a way to support themselves and their families, but also to regain a sense of security. Last month, Poland enacted a law allowing Ukrainian guests to legally live and work in the country for at least 18 months with full access to the state social protection system of healthcare and schooling. In addition, a Ukrainian citizen may also apply for a residence permit for another 3 years. The Polish government works together with the municipalities as they struggle to find out long-term housing, jobs, and placements in school for our Ukrainian guests. Given the fact that the refugees are predominantly women and with children, we are exploring the ways to support integration of women in the labor market. Once the examples in the care sector. Considering that the majority of refugees are women with children because men stayed and returned to Ukraine to defend their country, a big challenge is to provide nursery and kindergarten care. There are also programs in place to assist women finding employment in sectors where men are traditionally overrepresented. Mr. President, only in the capital city of Warsaw, there are 100,000 refugee children. 15,000 of them are already enrolled in schools. In the whole country, this number approaches 200,000. Children from Ukraine have the right to attend Polish schools on the same basis as Polish nationals. We offer different opportunities for children. Some newcomers are enrolling directly to the Polish schools, especially in the smaller towns. Poland is also establishing classes with all Ukrainian children and teachers who also have just arrived. These children will follow Ukrainian curriculum and be taught in Ukrainian. Ukrainian higher education students also have the opportunity to continue their education at the Polish universities. Patients evacuated from the oncological wards are being admitted to the hospitals worldwide thanks to the initiative of the Polish First Lady, undertook in cooperation with their counterparts and members of the royal families. And our First Lady has just visited also here the respected agencies in the United Nations system. It has also to be stressed that refugee children, just like all children around the world, were already dealing with the mental health challenges from being isolated during the almost 2 years of the pandemic. Now, having left the warm comforts of home, not to mention their fathers who stayed in Ukraine to fight, any move toward the pre-pandemic normalcy has been cruelly interrupted. We offer psychological and other mental health social services to help Ukrainian refugees. However, the needs are growing every day. And we cannot help everybody without active, concrete, coordinated, and immediate assistance from the international community, including the UN system. Mr. President, women are not only victims in this crisis, but are also carrying through their families, the communities, and the nation. We want to pay a tribute to Ukrainian women who in large numbers have joined the pro-European protest movement, and since then they have played a powerful role in Ukrainian civil society and directed relief efforts. Women-led organizations helped fund and supply the Ukrainian military, provided medical care, food and social services to the large internally displaced populations. Women volunteers are the majority of the humanitarian aid and service providers in Ukraine, often the first on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance and deliver life-saving supplies. I pay tribute to the organization like La Strada Ukraine that we just heard. Ukrainian women represented in their government are playing a key role in developing policies that will be crucial in mitigating the effects of the war in the aftermath of the conflict. So there is the war, but there is also hope and solidarity. In many cases, hope and solidarity have faces of women. Let them prevail. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the statement from Poland. We're now going to hear from Romania, I believe, next. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, Romania welcomes the initiative to hold a meeting dedicated to women's participation to the peace and security of Ukraine. I would first like to thank the briefers for their insightful contributions. At the outset, let me reiterate Romania's strong condemnation of the completely unjustified and unprovoked military attack of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, as well as the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in a number of occupied Ukrainian towns, now liberated. Romania reiterates its strong support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and remains committed to assisting Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. February 24th, 2022, will remain one of the darkest days in history after the end of the Second World War. This aggression has sparked massive displacement, forcing over 11 million people to flee their homes. Every day, we are witnessing women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities fleeing their houses, their hometowns, their country, seeking help in neighboring countries. Every day, we hear incredible and tragic life stories, women and children fleeing to save their lives, leaving behind their fathers, husbands, and sons. As we closely monitor the devastation and immense suffering, the international community must also maintain its focus on the continuing reports of horrific violations and abuses of human rights. The military actions of the Russian Federation disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. Children continue to be killed, wounded, and deeply traumatized by the violence all around them, while women and girls face an even higher risk of various forms of gender-based violence. Ukrainian women and children crossing international borders are more exposed to the risk of human trafficking, including online. Mr. President, Romania has been in the front line as one of the largest receiving countries for Ukrainians fleeing the terror since the beginning of the war. Alongside its allies and partners, Romania is trying to find the best solutions to help the population in need, be it on the territory of Ukraine or as refugees on Romania's territory. We also support the Republic of Moldova, which is facing a massive influx of Ukrainian refugees. The humanitarian response set up by the government of Romania was structured in 2 stages. The emergency response to the humanitarian crisis, covering the urgent needs at border crossing points, humanitarian transports, and the transport of refugees to temporary accommodation places, and the structural stage of developing protection mechanisms. As we approach the second phase of the intervention, the government has set up 6 working groups that have the role to design inclusion and protection policy measures in the following areas: health, education, labor, housing, vulnerable persons, children, and youth. Each working group develops sectorial action plans in collaboration with experts from the corresponding ministries, UN agencies, and representatives of the civil society. The response to all this human suffering has been swift and all-encompassing. We have seen national NGOs, international NGOs, UN institutions, but also simple Romanians from all across the country offering help, be it in food supplies, transportation, and accommodation in their own homes. Between February 10 and April 10, more than 700,000 Ukrainian citizens entered Romania. 80,000 are currently in our country. At the same time, between February 10 and today, almost 4,400 Ukrainian citizens applied for asylum in Romania. These citizens benefit from all rights provided by the Romanian legislation. Throughout the proceedings, asylum seekers can benefit from accommodation in the centers of the General Inspectorate for Immigration, if they so wish, as well as measures of material, financial, medical assistance, specialized psychological and legal counseling, access to the labor market, and cultural adaptation activities. Complementary, the asylum seekers can also benefit from the support of international and non-governmental organizations. Ukrainian citizens receive free medical care and appropriate treatment for emergencies through the National Emergency Medical Care System. Regarding children, I would like to underline that all Ukrainian children on the territory of Romania, including those who do not apply for a form of protection as provided by the law on asylum, have the right to receive education in Romanian schools in the same conditions as Romanian people. They have the right to receive free accommodation in boarding schools, food allowance, school supplies, footwear, clothing, and textbooks. Their health is examined in medical school offices, and if they have not received a vaccine, they can access the national vaccination scheme from the national program of the Ministry of Health. I would also like to mention that with the support of UNICEF and in partnership with the relevant Romanian institutions, as well as with local NGOs, Blue Dot centers have been set in place in several border crossing points to provide psychological and legal support and counsel to families and to unaccompanied minors arriving in Romania. Separated families are also helped to reunite. Mr. President, conflicts disproportionately harm women and girls. We are seeking this every day in the eyes of women and children that cross our border, fleeing Ukraine because of the Russian military aggression. We do our best to help them overcome these difficult times and to preserve their dignity. We stand up for our values. We stand united for those who are suffering. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for Romania's statement. We will now hear from the representative of Germany.
Thank you.
Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank you for organizing this briefing and Executive Director Sima Bahous of UN Women, as well as Mr. Fontaine from UNICEF and Ms. Sheria Pacha from La Stada International Ukraine for their important contributions to this meeting. The consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine on the situation of women and children are nothing but shocking. The horrible pictures from Bucha and Irpin of bodies of civilians lying dead on the streets are engraved in our memory. Among them were the bodies of women and girls who have become victims of sexual violence and rape by Russian soldiers and mercenaries. Some reports suggest that bodies of killed women and girls were burned or run over by the perpetrators trying to cover their deeds. These crimes and other crimes in dozens of Ukrainian cities will not be left unanswered against women and girls, but also against civilians. Germany fully supports the important work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the UN Human Rights Council has set in place a commission of inquiry that will investigate into these cases and others. We fully support the opening of an independent investigation by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan and will provide further assistance if needed. Germany will actively contribute to ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice, and it is important that all accountability mechanisms take into account the gender dimension of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Like in other conflicts, this war is impacting women and men differently, and it is often those that are already marginalized and face intersecting forms of discrimination who suffer most. We therefore have to ensure that women participate fully, equally, and meaningfully in decisions regarding humanitarian assistance, the refugee situation, as well as peace-building, reconstruction, recovery, and possible post-conflict scenarios, and that all measures are gender-responsive. Russia's aggression has caused one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War in Europe, and as the vast majority of those fleeing Ukraine are women and children, they are at risk of falling victim to criminal activity, as has been said by many briefers. It is crucial to protect women and children to the best extent possible, and in this regard we commend in particular the work of UNHCR and UNICEF. The disruption of education is a deeply aggravating factor, endangering the well-being of children who often arrive exhausted, traumatized, and malnourished in countries of destination. More than half of Ukraine's children have been displaced due to the war, and additionally more than 750 schools in Ukraine have been damaged since the beginning of the conflict, denying thousands of children access to education. We commend UNICEF's efforts to provide children of families fleeing the violence with education kits and to help repair damaged schools and kindergartens. And we also support the important work of UN Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund in Ukraine and in Moldova that has been explained by Sima Bahous. To conclude, Germany reiterates its full solidarity with Ukraine, including its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, and we renew our urgent call on President Putin to stop this war immediately, to end the indescribable human suffering, and to withdraw the Russian troops from Ukrainian territory fully and unconditionally. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And with that, there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, and this meeting is now adjourned.